If everyone could take a seat, we're going to get started. First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. This is an event that we're quite excited about. We are excited to have Christian Wolmar here, who will be speaking about his most recent book about the railroad in the United States. The book is for sale back at the back table, and Christian will be available after the talk to sign the book or whatever. And after Christian talks, we will have a short panel discussion featuring Buzz Paaswell, Ernest, Tollerson, and Juliette, Michaelson. And we'll be talking about what the impact of rail on the New York regional economy is moving forward, and some challenges that are facing the New York economy in the context of rail investment and maintenance. And with that, I would like to introduce Christian Wolmar.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here, but I feel a charlatan in several ways, actually. First of all, I'm not an academic, even though I write books that sort of purport to be kind of definitive, and academics quote from them, but I'm not an academic, I'm a journalist. And we can have a long discussion about that, but we won't. And I'm also a charlatan because here I am, a Brit, who's come along and written about your railways. Or, I must get used to this, railroads, which has kind of been a bane of my life. You think about editing a 130,000 word book and changing railway to railroad kind of all the way through. It was quite a job. And so, you know, I feel a little bit of a con merchant, but in the 40 minutes that I have or so, I'm going to try and do there used to be a Shakespeare company that did a kind of instant Shakespeare in kind of 40 minutes or 50 minutes, and it ran through the whole. I mentioned every play and every plot almost, and I'm going to try and do that with the railroads, and try to put the railroads in a bit of context, to try to explain why they're important, why they've been forgotten about, why they were loved and then reviled, and I'll talk very briefly at the end about you know, I think what's happening now in railway politics. So, Jesus, right. Sorry about that. Right, that jumped me through 3 different types of modes of transport all in one go. Okay, so birth of railways. Why did railroads happen? And I suppose it's the economy is stupid. You know, railways were all about cheapening, reducing the cost of transport. But they did happen at a very interesting technological time. You know, it could have been, and I postulated this in one of my books, that actually railroads wouldn't have happened. I mean, if various kind of inventions in relation to the automobile and to roads had happened, we might not have got railroads, or we might not have got them in the form that we got them. But why do we get railroads? Because the roads were lousy. This was one of the few turnpikes in America, and you can see it was pretty crude and basic. There was a brief flourish of canals. America came later to the canals than Britain. America was about 20, 30 years behind in industrialization at that point. Of course, America caught up in the 19th century, but it was behind. And there is one big flaw with this canal. This was the most successful canal, the Erie Canal, but there's one big flaw, which you might notice, which is that it only has one towpath. And therefore, every time 2 of these boats met, somebody had to unharness, take the horses round, and there were probably big fisticuff fights about who did that, particularly if it was the 10th boat you met in the other direction in a particular day. And that slowed down the operation. They also froze, so they were not kind of the perfect form of transport. They were much better than anything that went before. And of course, then we had a brief flourishing a period of the steamship, which again was a period that lasted maybe 30, 40 years when steamships prevailed. And of course their limitations are pretty obvious. They can only go where the rivers go. It was a real hassle going upriver. In fact, the first steamship got down to the bottom of the Mississippi, and I don't think it ever managed to get up again. So, you know, it was not really ideal. So it was perfect for the 1830s were perfect for the invention of the railroad. And there were actually two railroads which opened in the 1830s. The Baltimore and Ohio, which is conventionally the one that is in all the storybooks and kind of everybody talks about. But actually there's a smaller railroad, or it was a longer railroad initially, the Charleston and Hamburg, which was the first one that used American locomotive technology, but was also, for a brief period, at 134 miles, it was the longest railroad in the world. But it kind of got forgotten about, partly because it got subsumed into another railroad, and partly because it was in the South, and I think that things that happening in the North got more kind of publicity and longer history than things that happened in the North. And also, sadly, the guy who was portrayed at the end there, next to the engine, perished in an accident very soon afterwards because he got irritated by the valve mechanism that activated the steam, and he shut it. And the pressure built up and it blew up and it killed him and somebody else. That showed the kind of perils, the early perils of the technology. The American growth in railways was absolutely stupendous, and it's a theme that I come back to throughout this little talk. It was really, quite an extraordinary achievement. Within 10 years, there was more than 1,000 miles of railroad, and this was, interestingly enough, all tended to be kind of quite small railways, and not kind of at that time big companies. But the growth was remarkably fast, and much faster than in Europe, and it was not very long before America had more railways than anyone else. And why did that happen? There were several reasons. One of the reasons was because it was done on the cheap. In Europe, we would not have had a bridge that kind of looked quite as perilous as this and kind of dangerous. We just, we built things to a higher standard. Now, when I wrote that in an earlier book, Blood, Iron and Gold, which is the story of the world's railways and their impact on the world, I got roundly criticized by somebody on Amazon who kind of thought I was insulting America by saying that they were done on the cheap, which wasn't true at all. It was just that it's a fact that America embraced this technology but adapted it and had, for example, steeper gradients, it had sharper curves, but it was able to do it more cheaply. One reason as well was that it had the right of eminent domain. In other words, once a company got the charter for the railways, it was able to do whatever it wanted with the land and take whatever land it needed. In Britain, we had an endless struggle between the railroads and the landowners, who were very resistant to having railways built across their land and would charge enormous amounts for very kind of small slivers of land. That didn't happen in the United States. Another reason was that you had imported technology. Only for a brief period, for about 10 years, the technology was largely imported from the UK, and a little bit from France as well. But again, it was adapted to American purposes very quickly. Now, this locomotive, for example, came in kit form, and an American engineer, without any drawings, managed to kind of put it together, which I think is kind of testimony to American kind of flexibility. Then we have the thorny issue of the relationship between government and the railroads. And this is one of my personal obsessions, because in Britain we've gone through privatization, and it's a constant debate, and I often kind of go on radio and TV discussing rail privatization and the impact, and it's a constant kind of source of controversy and discussion. And many of the American history books on the history of the railways like to portray it as entirely a free enterprise. And it really wasn't. When one of the ways that the railroads were supported in the early days by the government was that the army would carry out these surveys of the land and checking out where the railway could go, which was actually a very expensive process. And very soon, as early as 1835, railroads started getting land from the government, allocated land to kind of support it. And by the 1850s, this was a big means of support. And there was also support from the state. The federal government technically was not allowed to actually offer any support to the railways, even though they did in these hidden ways. State governments did, and often lost quite a lot of money and issued bonds to support the railways and so on. So it was very much a joint enterprise between government and the private sector, what these days we'd call a public-private partnership. And it was a big debate about what sort of railway there was going to be. As I said, that a lot of the early railways were small railways which might just serve a particular town with the outlying area or whatever, or a particular mine or whatever. And there was this debate which one could characterize as between the Jeffersonian view of that things would, of America really, that things would stay local, the hometown, the kind of small marketplace or whatever, and the Hamiltonian view. And that came to a head in this battle of the gauges. Gauges, I don't go into technicalities in my books. I concentrate on the kind of politics and economics. The gauge is the one technicality you have to when you go into railroad history, because it's absolutely crucial. And in this instance, this particular town, Erie, had two different railways coming at it with different gauges. And now that was very profitable for the local people, because the local people had to cart all the stuff between one station and another. The passengers all had to get off. They probably kind of stayed in a hotel at night and so on. And when the railway company tried to kind of merge the two, they were actually set upon, and the townspeople kind of threw a lot of wagons in the river and so on. So it kind of portrayed how there was a contrasting view of America in the development of the railways, in terms of, we had on the one hand the big companies, which coincidentally is called Erie, the biggest company of the initial days, which set itself out as building a railway halfway across America, and the other companies which kind of set themselves as actually building small town America. So lots of places got bypassed by the railways, and that again is a really interesting issue in terms of the economics. You know, what does the railway do? Does it go from one end to another, or does it actually just serve the local areas and kind of connect local towns with one another? And eventually, of course, because railways make profits from the longer distance they go to, the idea of long-distance railways actually won through. So this is 1860, which is not a kind of truncated view of America. This is actually the railways that existed at that point, which barely go over the Mississippi and are pretty intense in the northeast, and the corridor that still actually has the best railways in the country. 30,000 miles of railroad, which is much more than, for example, the UK or France ever had at its peak. So within 30 years, America had built a fantastic network of railroads, largely with private money, and not as well connected maybe as this looks like. Often in towns you had to kind of get off one railway and another and so on. But nevertheless, and as you can see, much better railroad network in the north than in the south. And that was to be crucial in the Civil War, which was, I've written another book called Engines of War, which is about the use of railways in wartime. And the Civil War is very important in terms of railroad history, as well as obviously in terms of wider American history, in that it was the first railroad war, which was entirely served by railroads on both sides. The North had the better railroads, and that was to prove absolutely crucial in the war. And it was all about building railroads and destroying railroads. And actually, you can see from this, the railroads are still crude, because this is actually, the rails were wooden with a strip of metal over them, which was a very crude way of kind of building railways. And the battles took place around railroad junctions. The American Civil War was different in scale and width or length over which battles took place. It killed 630,000 Americans, which is more Americans than in all other wars in which America has been involved throughout its history. Which is an amazing statistic. And it was also fought over a distance of around 1,500 miles. No other war had that with simultaneous fights kind of in so many different places, because it was the railroad that enabled that to happen. So we get, after the Civil War, we have this fantastic, absolutely amazing takeoff of the railways, where it is very difficult to disentangle. I mean, those of you who studied economics, and I studied economics, it is very difficult to disentangle the notion of, was it the railroads which brought economic growth, or was it economic growth which stimulated the development of so many railways? But in the 1870s, for example, after the Transcontinental was built, there were 40,000 miles of railway built in one decade, which is more than 10 miles a day, which in a country with a population of about 35, 40 million. I mean, it's a kind of mind-boggling kind of achievement, and I still don't really, even despite the fact I've researched it and kind of looked into it, I still don't really understand how that was feasible in terms of the amount of labor that had to go into that, the amount of resources that had to go to building 10 miles every day, day after day. These days, you know from your discussions about kind of building high-speed rail or whatever, you'd be lucky to build 10 miles of railroad in a year, in the way kind of progress is made. We're building a tunnel under London, which is all of 3 miles long, and it's taken 40 years to discuss it, and it's going to take 8 years to build it. And I know that's difficult territory, but nevertheless, it's kind of in comparison, it does seem amazing. So that was stimulated by the building of the Transcontinental, which, as you can see, I use this map to show that it wasn't a transcontinental. It didn't quite, it had the railways to the east had obviously already been built. And in fact, America has never had a transcontinental railway, really. It has always stopped in Chicago or St. Louis or other places. It's barely ever been possible. Amtrak did it briefly to take a railway, a train from one end of America to another for complex reasons, which I won't go into, but I do discuss it in the book. So the Transcontinental, which was both an amazing achievement and slightly dominates railroad literature, actually. There is too much about it. There's too many books about the Transcontinental and not enough about kind of all the other amazing things that happened on the railways. But it was both an amazing achievement and also was, I think, the beginning of the sort of dislike and suspicion of the railways because of the vast amount of corruption that it entailed. It was a very clever trick. I mean, the boat on both sides, it was built by two railways, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. It was a very clever trick. Both of these companies created kind of building companies that built the railway, and they charged the main company. And that was a transfer price which they could charge anything for. And they made all the profits in the building company. And of course, the people who owned the railroad also owned the building company, so the construction company. So they made absolute fortunes, and particularly on the eastern side, the Crédit Mobilier company, which it's almost, funny enough, its records all got burned kind of 2 years after, and so we never actually found out how much it ripped off. And it was all about land. It was a great big land grab where the rights of the Indians were forgotten about completely. The buffaloes were wiped out. Settlers were brought in enormous numbers to both populate the land that they had bought, that they'd been given, and to actually make use of the railways that were then built. And this, I couldn't give this lecture without just the picture, the most famous picture in American railroad history, which is the joining together of the two railways at Promontory Point, a point actually incidentally rather ironic, which is no longer on the railroad. because they built a diversion. But it was both a celebration of American enterprise and a celebration of kind of corruption on an absolute massive scale. So so once they built these railroads, they had to have something to do with them. There's a rather interesting book called Railroaded, which is about the transcontinental, which argues quite forcibly that actually they built these railways too early and they built too many of these railways. And it's quite reasonable to accept that. So they went around marketing these railways and trying to attract settlers of any kind. They even sent people to France and England and Ireland to attract people onto these railways to give them a function, as it were, for having kind of invested all this money and largely government money in their construction. And so then we have a period of about 30, 40 years where railways are absolutely ubiquitous. They range from railways like this, which went up into the Catskills, aimed at these sort of affluent people. Some of them were actually private railways where, if you didn't own a mansion in the Catskills, you couldn't go on the railway to get there, unless you were the servants or whatever, kind of semi-private railways. And a whole range of luxurious railways, which are ones that are always written about and emphasized in the stories, whereas actually, in fact, for the most part, that was the reality of kind of traveling on railways in that era. Yes, there were some wonderful trains, but there were also some mostly awful trains. This is an immigrant train. But for the by and large, the kind of service on the railways was pretty inadequate. They were a monopoly, and they provided for the affluent people in obviously much more carefully than they did for the hoi polloi. So this is the 1880s. 94,000 miles of railway. Already, it's the basics of the network is established. Not quite all the transcontinentals are built. It ends up being 5 transcontinental railways get built. But already we see that the railways are becoming almost ubiquitous. Almost any town of any size needs a railway. And if it doesn't have a railway, it probably dies, or it probably kind of suffers greatly economically. The railway determines success or failure. And the frequency of the railways and the trains are very important. And that's where we get to the turning point. The railways reach their apogee of power and then start to become unpopular. And this is a fascinating part of the story for me, because although railways were sometimes unpopular in the UK or in Europe, where I've written about, I don't think they ever reached the kind of level of dislike and distrust that they did in America. And whether this is a kind of part of what has been called American exceptionalism, I don't know, but certainly there is something of that in it, that there is some innate kind of dislike of the railways. But they did a lot of things to get themselves disliked. They became dominated by a series of about half a dozen kind of major companies owned by moguls. This is Harriman, but owned by the Vanderbilts and families like that, J.P. Morgan, who began to dominate the network and own vast mileages, 15,000-20,000 miles typically of railroad. And obviously there was great distrust of them, particularly as we're just coming off the back of the Crédit Mobilier scandal and other scandals in relation to the establishment of the railways. And then another reason is labor disputes. And this is an interesting bit of history in terms of the fact that labor disputes these days, generally the public and the newspapers are in favor of the management. But in those days, there was quite a lot of support for the workers, partly because a lot of them worked 50, 60-hour weeks without any overtime for fairly low wages, though the job was stable, but kind of not very well paid. And there was a series in the 1870s and 1880s of labor disputes which led to the creation of the railroad unions. And indeed, as with many things, it was the railways which were really responsible for the first major unions, and you know, again, a kind of part of the importance of railroad history. And interestingly, papers were like those owned by Hearst actually favoured the workers in these disputes. So that was another source of kind of dislike. And there was this notion too that, you know, the railways had ruined that way of life. You know, that the kind of comfortable backwards kind of little town life had been spoiled, and instead the railways had created this kind of hustle bustle, you know, which in today's terms would have seemed a very quiet form of life. And then there was safety. Safety only became a big issue on the railways probably in the beginning of the 1860s, 1870s. There had been rail accidents before, but there weren't that many trains, and the trains tended to go slower. But as trains speeded up and there were more trains, there was more causes of accident. I mean, God knows how these engines ended up like that. But it was probably something what's called a cornfield meet, with some irony, which is that the dispatchers would send off two locomotives trains heading towards each other on the same line without having realised. And once they did that, there was nothing they could do, because of course they had telegraphs but not radio communications with the trains. And you know, safety became quite an issue, that the railroads were disregarded safety, particularly actually for those working on the railway. It was a terribly dangerous job. The death tolls were maybe 2,000 or 3,000 at the peak, and you know, particularly working in a railway yard, you know, making up the trains and doing shunting work was an incredibly dangerous job, and there were very few people who had all their fingers by the end of it, because they were just all, you know, they would stand between trains, kind of getting them to come together, and you know, with inevitable results. But crucially, the key people who managed to get legislation enacted against to regulate the railways were the Granger movement, the farmers, who complained that the railroads had a monopoly over their transport. America had moved from an agricultural subsistence society of the days before the railway to cash crops, and if you couldn't bring those cash crops to market, they were useless. So there were endless tales of people having to burn their corn in the fields because it was no use, or using it to burn the fires or whatever. Some of this was very unfair, actually, because it was not the railroad's fault necessarily. There were world factors over the world price of corn and grain and the like. There was also bad harvests and whatever. But nevertheless, thanks to books like The Octopus and various other, and a very strong movement from the Grangers, they managed to bring about the creation of regulation for the railways in any concerted way for the first time in 1887, and that was to change the nature of what railroads could do. Initially, the commission was not very efficient, but nevertheless, it managed to. It did exert some often quite unnecessary control over the railroads, even though I mean, one would accept they did need some creation. So this is the peak of the railways, which is actually just during the First World War, 250,000 miles of railroad. And again, that is just breathtaking. You know, that this happened in less than 100 years. 250,000 miles was built, and there were railroads of basically every conceivable type. You know, the railroads were still a monopoly, really, I mean, largely until 1910, 1915. There was still a monopoly. So they created all kinds of different railways. These were the interurban railways, of which there were 25,000 miles of them. And there were sort of little tram systems that ran alongside, usually alongside highways, very cheaply produced, electrically operated, maybe 1 an hour, you know, probably just 10 cents to kind of get on it. And you know, it took you maybe 30, 40 miles, you know, and only lasted really about 20 years, these systems, most of them, because they clearly were you know, never could really sustain a market. And at one point, you could actually travel from Wisconsin to New York entirely on these things, which probably would have taken you a couple of weeks, and wouldn't have cost you very much. But I'm not sure anybody ever did, apart from to show that you could do. Then there are suburban railways. I think probably the type of railway that America has most sadly lost in a way. I mean, suburban railways, are the most effective in a way form of transport for urban areas, and and the railways created initial suburbs. We now think of cars having created the suburban America, but the railways created the early suburban America, and quite successfully. But it's always a difficult market in terms of subsidy, because you run trains 2 or 3, twice a day maybe, and so you have all this rolling stock and you have all this stuff that is only to take people in and out of town once a day, but nevertheless performs a fantastic, fantastically useful, and for those of you economists, provides more externalities, I think, than virtually any other type of railway, but sadly not always recognised, or very rarely recognised by lawmakers and politicians. You have L's in 2 cities, mainly Chicago and New York, but in 1 or 2 other places as well. Again, an effective form of railway, but a pain in the neck for the office workers who had to kind of live next to a steam engine going past their door every kind of minute or 2. You had electrification to some extent. America did not electrify its railways very much, and I think that was probably a great mistake. There's some in the Northeast Corridor that were electrified. The odd tunnel was electrified, but it didn't electrify the vast totality of its railways in the way that lots of other countries did. And this was the era, this kind of period of the first decade or 2 of the 20th century, the era of the great railway station, the great establishment of power by the railways, saying, we are here, and this is Penn Station, which sadly I arrived at yesterday, and it doesn't look like that anymore, as I'm sure you know, and is probably the worst big mainline station I've ever been in my life, apart from Birmingham New Street. If any of you have been to Birmingham New Street, it's very similar in that it's kind of underground and doesn't exist on the top, and one of the great architectural bits of vandalism. Can anybody guess where this is? This is Kansas City. And I show this picture and it still exists. Fortunately, they didn't demolish it. I show this picture really to show just how ubiquitous the power of the railways was. The fact that they built a station, such an amazing cathedral to railroads in Kansas City, I think it was finished in 1910 or something, at the height of their power. They were ubiquitous, the railways were everywhere, and they thought that it was going to last forever, sadly. Just as General Motors probably thinks it's going to last forever. And so then we get the long, slow decline of the railways, which really starts in the 1920s, or starts in the First World War, when the railways are taken over by the government briefly. Amazingly enough, the railways were nationalised in 1916 because they performed so badly and they were so necessary for the war effort that the federal government took them over, didn't quite know what to do them, reprivatised them quite soon after the war, and we get a period of decline where the railways are struggling desperately to try to save themselves, and they're very good at marketing at that stage. They try and sell themselves as much as possible. They create kind of fancy new equipment, particularly steam, but that doesn't really work. But this does work. The fantastic diesel locomotives and trains that are created in the 1930s as a kind of last gasp of the fantastic rail travel. And this was really comfortable rail travel with an emphasis on the journey itself, looking out the window, kind of You know, at one point they put headlights out of the window to kind of so you could see at night, but they realized it wasn't really quite worth doing. But it was a good try. But so it was again, it was a last kind of gasp of the railways to try and establish a role for themselves in the face of competition. But the competition came successively in terms of Greyhound buses created in the 1920s, the truck, which took away much of their short-haul business very quickly in the 1920s and 1930s, especially old army trucks like this one. And eventually the DC-3, which was about the first time you could vaguely safely think you could take a plane and have a good chance of getting there. There was an awful lot of quite famous people who died in early plane crashes before the DC-3, when really it was not a very safe form of transport, but they were desperate to try to avoid it. And briefly, there was a cooperation between the airlines and the railways, because you couldn't fly at night, so they would run you on the train for the day, during the night, overnight, and then you take a plane for a few hundred miles during the day and so on and get across America like that. It saved a day or so on the travel. But gradually, of course, the airlines ate into the railway market. And again, you have another brief heyday where the Second World War, where because of petrol shortages, the railroads again become very important, something that is completely forgotten about in much of the history. That even in the Second World War, most of the troops, most of the freight was all taken to the ports. This time it was easier to do because it was both on the East Coast and the West Coast. So it was again a period when the railways briefly flourished and were briefly entirely vital for the infrastructure. And then I think you get what is the coup de grace for the railways, or for passenger rail, which is the interstate highways, developed by Eisenhower. Eisenhower had to travel across America during the First World War, and never forgot the fact that it took him something like 20 days to get across with his army across America. And so when he became president in the 1950s, quickly enacted the legislation to get the interstate system created, which of course, people say the railways are subsidized. This is massively subsidized, and that's a whole debate that we can have. And the railways have a long period of decline, and then are saved really at the last moment in different ways. They have a period of decline when the mileage goes down from 250,000 during this period to about 95,000. And the passenger railway is almost completely wiped out. It's touch and go whether there's going to be anything left apart from maybe the New York subway and New Jersey Transit and one or two other little things like that. But the freight companies that own the railways and own the tracks are just absolutely eager to get rid of the railways. And sometimes they're so eager to get rid of the railroads that when they get given permission by the Interstate Commerce Commission to close a line, they actually just boot the passengers out at the minute they get the permission. And they did that in several instances until once they did it to a congressman, and they got put stop to it. But we were absolutely anxious to do it. And there was about a year of negotiation about what should happen, and eventually America nationalizes its passenger rail network, which is kind of quite remarkable given the suspicion which any government kind of involvement in a commercial activity takes place. But so America has this odd anomaly of having a nationalized passenger rail network, which is inadequate in many ways. I've traveled much around the Amtrak system, but nevertheless, at least a nub of passenger railways survived. Freight, on the other hand, was also under great threat and losing money and having all kinds of problems, and got saved by the Staggers Act, which deregulated freight, and the creation of Conrail, again a nationalized kind of company briefly for a decade or so, and then became subject to the biggest privatization. And that saved the freight railways. because they were still under the constraint of ridiculous over-regulation. They couldn't charge what they wanted to charge. There are all sorts of rules and regulations about it. That deregulation was one of the rare deregulations that actually profited both both industry and the consumers. And now the freight railways, and this is something that is completely forgotten about. When I go to people and say, oh, I'm writing a book about American railways, and they say, oh, well, that must be a rather short book. You know, we've got hardly any American railways in America. Oh, wrong, you know, completely wrong. You've got 95,000 miles of railroad. You have some of the most profitable railroad companies, half a dozen fantastically profitable railroad companies, which you know, Warren Buffett bought this particular company, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, 3 years ago, and you know, Warren Buffett doesn't generally back losers, and you know, they continued to have been profitable even during the recession and to expand their businesses in all sorts of ways. The problem is there is a tension between passenger railways and freight railways, and there is only kind of one network, and the freight railways really hate sharing their tracks with passenger railways. The passenger railways have different demands. They want to go faster. They don't want to have the type of track that, you know, is really kind of very hard, and so it gives them a very bad ride, and passengers don't like that, and so on. There is a conflict between the two, and it is difficult to see, you know, how the two can coexist on much of the network. So we have Amtrak, which is desperately trying to modernize, has terrible system of using trains. I mean, I can't imagine why when you get on an American train, first of all they ask for ID, which God knows why, you know, because you're going to blow up the train or whatever. But then you get on the train and you know, they check your ticket as you get on the train, and then another set of people checks your ticket when you're on the train, and then ridiculously they issue you with another ticket and stick it on the baggage holder above you, and there's kind of, you know, 3 or 4 guys or women for you know, 8 carriages of people. I mean, in Europe you just don't have that. I mean, it's just the labor needs reform, but so does the management. You know, it's the management's responsibility to do that, and Amtrak needs to both cut its cost and modernize, and it's always under government control. It's you know, I mean, I'm a fan of nationalized railways, but not railways that are nationalized in a way that the government kind of decides on every little thing to do with the railway. So today, for example, I got a press release in my inbox which says, you know, the federal government has given £30 million to South Carolina to improve, you know, Amtrak. You know, it's that type of management that is completely unnecessary. You know, that type of detail from the government. So Amtrak is desperately trying to, or Amtrak and President Obama is desperately trying to create a high-speed rail network, you know, like this. You know, typically in California, where you know, the estimate is that it would cost nearly $100 billion to build such a network. I personally think that's the wrong path to go down, and that actually America should concentrate on improving the railroads it's got, particularly in the Northeast Corridor and all sorts of city pairs, rather than kind of jumping a technology. I don't think America is ready for high-speed rail, but it's a debate that maybe we can have later. So I leave you with an image of the British version of the book, just to show that we are different separated by a common language, and also the fact that actually the train spotters amongst my readers, not me, or rail fans, or foamers as I think you call them, spotted the fact that this is a Canadian locomotive, which caused me quite some problems. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy.
Well, Christian will be around. We'll have some time for some questions after the panel, and I'd like to invite the panel to come up to the table. And for those who don't know me, my name is David King. I'm on the faculty in the urban planning program here at Columbia University. I study transportation and land use and teach in those fields as well. For the panel, we have Buzz Paaswell from City College, Ernest Tollerson, who's with the MTA, and Juliette Michaelson, who's with the Regional Plan Association. And I'd like to start with Buzz and give him a chance to offer his, take a few minutes and offer his reflections on the role of rail, not just in a growing economy or a growing period. But really, now that the New York region is mature, the economy is mature, and the network is mature, what are the challenges facing us, and how do we move forward from here?
Of course, I will answer your question with things that I'm going to say that are independent of what your question was about. But Christian, it was a great talk, and as you know, as we've discussed in the past, all little children grow up to be great lovers of trains, and I think some of us are in the transportation business. So we continue to play with trains, and probably one of the most exciting pieces of research I've done was when I was still at Illinois, and it was for I think the Chicago Northwestern Railroad or something. But I got to ride in the cab of a diesel locomotive from Chicago to Champaign-Urbana. I think that's probably the highlight of my career. I want to make three quick. I had some prepared remarks when I thought that the subject was going to be a little different, David, but I can talk about railroad work that I've done, and I just want to make three sort of disparate remarks. The first is about high-speed rail, and perhaps a misconception about high-speed rail. And for those of you that have ridden high-speed rail in Europe or in Asia, know that it's a totally different animal than Amtrak here. And the difficulty with selling high-speed rail in the United States is that it's being sold as not Amtrak light, but Amtrak heavy. It's as if you're going to take Amtrak and make it better. And if you're going to really have high-speed rail, you're going to have a totally different mode that looks different, operates differently, and creates different economic kinds of conditions. And my friends, when in the railroad business, what they really talk about is we're looking at improvements incrementally instead of really building high-speed rail, which means welded track, electrification across the country, all those things which are billions of dollars of investment. Really say we should really be talking about less low-speed rail, which is probably a better way to describe it. But you're right, that rail is only successful passenger rail is only successful in a couple of corridors in the United States, but mostly in the Midwest around the Great Lakes, the Northeast Corridor, and in California. And they found where they've upgraded the rail, where the states have taken initiatives in Washington and Maine and the Northeast Corridor, and made service a little better than you would expect, but certainly not at the standard that regional rail, not even high-speed rail in Europe is, that passengers are flocking to it. And I think all of us in the room who are in transportation know now that in the air-rail mode split between New York and Washington, Amtrak wins out, despite the fact that it's expensive, it's hard to ride on Amtrak, but it is convenient, and in one sense it's reliable. And part of the problem is due to the fact that going on airlines has really now become such an onerous business. Going through airports is part of the problem. The second thing I want to talk about, and this ties to the high-speed rail, is a few years ago I reviewed a book about terminals in Europe, rail terminals in Europe, and how terminals on high-speed rail have become central places themselves and have changed cities. So cities like Lille and smaller cities not the size of New York or London, but cities perhaps the size of Birmingham or Lille or other cities in all through Europe, have decided that being on a high-speed rail network really pays off, and that by having a modern terminal which houses offices, and it might have amusements, and it might become a central place and a place for economic development and economic growth, really serve the fact that what high-speed rail does is shrink distances between locations, so that traveling now from New York to Paris, that would be, Paris is on my mind, but from London to Paris, or London to Belgium, or from Milan to Rome, now become a matter of a few hours or less. So these become close pairs, day commutes or less than that, and the station areas, being around the station area is very important. And it gives you a sense, and something I've argued for the 22 years I've been in New York, Penn Station is probably one of the most valuable pieces of property in New York, and the developers should actually realize it and make it more of a central place than it is. And maybe that's an argument that they have to have with the Dolans that won't move Madison Square Garden out of it, but that's a whole other thing. Third thing I want to talk about, and I will be brief, David, but it really gets to the heart of freight rail. And one of the most interesting studies we've done at the University Transportation Research Center centered around the fact that several years ago there was a plan to build an intermodal freight terminal on Long Island at a place called Pilgrim State Hospital. An intermodal terminal, is where they either load bulk or they load container cargo from trucks onto trains, trains onto trucks. But basically, it's making great utilization of trains. And I think one of the things that people who understand freight rail know that most of the freight rail in the United States stops either in New Jersey or at Scranton, but doesn't come into the New York area. One of the reasons Jerry Nadler wants a tunnel is to bring freight into New York area. And Long Island, which if you thought of Long Island as an urban area, it's probably one of the 10 largest urban areas in the United States. Long Island moves maybe 3 or 4% of its freight by rail, whereas the rest of the country, it ranges between 30 and 80%, depending on where in the country you are. So the idea was to begin to make Long Island more economically competitive by bringing true rail freight out to Long Island, and to do that you needed intermodal terminals. Well, by choosing Pilgrim State, State DOT did a quick study, and in doing a quick study, what they did was, in a sense, alienate everyone around it, who convinced the legislature to take Pilgrim State and turn it into a park. And they were about to pass that when the state DOT and a few congressmen asked the governor to veto that and have a real study about whether or not rail freight is needed and what it would look like and where you could create intermodal terminals. And the governor was asked to have an independent group, which was the University Transportation Research Center, do an independent study that wasn't tied to DOT, the railroads, or any of the stakeholders, but was an independent look. And I put together a team of people that range from community involvement experts to rail experts to urban planners to a whole range of people and economists to look at taking the question away, was Pilgrim State the right site? Because State DOT did an environmental impact statement that sort of started with Pilgrim State is right and here's why, as opposed to, where should we do it? So we said, is rail freight necessary on Long Island? And if so, is Pilgrim State or any other site a good site for an intermodal terminal? And the third thing is, if it were, what are the environmental impacts, and how do you look into, how do you abate them? And it's a long lecture I give, and I'm not going to obviously do that now. The end result was we felt that Long Island is really starved of rail freight. You could get a tremendous number of trucks off the road, and you could begin to bring in the kinds of intermodal facilities that would allow the development of larger kinds of facilities, whether they're big box stores or huge lumber yards, or things for construction or things for selling, food transfer stations, other kinds of things that would really make Long Island much more economically competitive, not only with the rest of the state, but with neighboring states. And we found that, yes, Pilgrim State was a good site, but we named several other sites, and we're pleased to see that right now several of the other sites in Long Island have been picked up by private developers and are being developed as intermodal sites. And we talked about how to mitigate the damage and what you go on with that. But it shows that rail freight does have a place. As Christian said, there's a tremendous battle between the people that own the freight railroads, who are represented by the American Association of Railroads, and passenger rails. Anytime you're on the highest speed rail in the United States, the Northeast Corridor, and the train slows down, you know that there's freight someplace in there. You go from New York to Albany, and the train might slow down, and there's a random freight that has in there. We need, if we're going to talk seriously about passenger rail, we need to separate the two. If we're going to talk about high-speed rail, we have to talk first about what rail can look like, what terminals can look like, and what are points of interchange. And finally, we have to talk more seriously about developing more intermodal freight east of the Hudson in New York City, especially out to Long Island and further up north.
Great. Well, thank you. Ernest Tollerson has some prepared remarks. Do you want me to do your slides, or?
Or I can do them.
Okay.
All right. But since Buzz has been talking about high-speed rail and playing off of what Christian said, I just want to mention in terms of high-speed rail that, here in the Northeast, we're probably in the one region with the density that can justify it. And, for those of you who have been in Japan, the distance between, New York and Philadelphia is what, about 90 miles. In Japan, that's a trivial distance because they have high-speed rail, and people think nothing of commuting that distance to work. And if we had high-speed rail, we could pair a city that has what I would call a relatively cold economy in good times like Philadelphia, with a city like New York that has a sort of more robust economy. And you think about pairing points like Buffalo and Toronto, high-speed rail can do that. And of course, I think what Buzz and I are both talking about is high-speed rail on dedicated corridors, not getting to this business of negotiating with the freights. But I think there's a whole set of both sort of, there are climate stabilization reasons to do it, and there are co-benefits that have to do with economic development. But in any case, I thought what I would do was sort of talk about why I think mass transit is going to become more important in the region. As you know, the MTA covers a 5,000 square mile territory with the city, subways and buses, and then commuter rail systems for Long Island, you know, sort of part of Connecticut and the Hudson Valley. So in a really, really good economy, the New York State economy will throw off something like 305 million metric tons of CO2. Obviously that's way down because of the Great Recession, but if you really think that it's important to stabilize the climate, by the way, does everyone here think it's important to stabilize the climate, sort of bend the carbon curve? Most people, half, yes, no? I can't hear you. Yes, all right. So, so if we're going to bend the carbon curve, right, and I don't know whether you want to get it back down to 350 parts per million or back down to the sort of pre-industrial level of 280, but if you're going to do that, this has got to change. And of course, you've got to innovate and come up with new technologies in energy, and you've got to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings, but you've got to reduce it from mobile sources. And a lot of folks in New York State, and I was on the team, a combination of government agencies, people in the private sector, and academics, spent a lot of time in 2010 thinking about how you bend the curve just in this state. And given existing technology, we sort of saw a way between now and about 2030 to get from, let's say you were bumping up along the top at over 300 or around 298. By 2030, to get that down by maybe 100, 140 million metric tons, but we couldn't get down to like 50 or 53 million metric tons by 2050, which is what you would need to do in this state, to go from what you do in a great economy down to 50, to kind of vindicate this goal of cutting emissions, you know, 80% by 2050. So that's a real and challenge, and I think as people begin in this country to sort of wrap their heads around it, they're going to come around to sort of making more investments in transit. So essentially, I think what we want to do is have more transit, even if our emissions go up a bit, the emissions of transit, to get people out of cars and reduce the carbon profile of the city and the region. This, is, by the way, is a slide done by a friend of mine, Tim Papandreou, actually he's moved from LA Metro now to the San Francisco Metro system. But again, if you begin to think about carbon on a normalized basis, you want to sort of reduce the carbon per passenger mile and that sort of thing. Skip that. Now, what I really want to show you is that when you think about what we do at the MTA, we have to spend a lot of money on traction power and a lot of money on fuel for buses. So overall, our emissions profile, you know, is north of 2.1 million metric tons of CO2. But the good news is the fact that you guys use us, we exist, we actually avoid the emission of close to 17 million metric tons of CO2. And that, we would argue, has a value. So if you go on the internet and you Google something called H46, which is this big research project of the federal government, there's now a big effort to sort of begin to untangle and figure out transit's contribution to reducing the amount of carbon expended. And so I think over the course of probably the next 3 or 4 years, obviously the US is sort of, in a sense, a laggard in its thinking about carbon and what to do. But you're going to see a lot of work on sort of demonstrating how transit can reduce the carbon footprint, and even more important, how the combination of transit plus green commercial and residential development, the synergy between the two can do a lot to kind of reduce carbon emissions. So as this understanding evolves, I think people's appreciation and interest in funding transit will increase, and things will get better. And just briefly, the thing to sort of make this case that mass transit can be part, one of several major climate stabilization tools, I just sort of wanted you to briefly take a look at this, that there's the debit side, the emissions from transit, but then there are the elements that create the credit side. So I hope that you'll leave here and you'll begin to sort of think about, when you sort of think about stabilizing climate, you won't only think about solar and wind and energy efficiency and those things that usually pop up, but you'll think of mass transit and high-speed rail as also part of the package of getting to climate stabilization, we hope sometime in this century. So that's what I wanted to sort of just do by context. I didn't want to be a slide addict and do a lot of stuff. I did want to briefly show this side, which is, there's a lot of stuff you do to kind of green the operations of a system like the MTA that you'll never see. So at the Coney Island Rail Yard, which I believe is probably the largest rail yard in North America, I think it is. You would?
Chicago.
Possibly Chicago. Anyway, we think it's many, many football fields. It's really large. At a place like this, you can imagine that we have huge needs for power to heat water. So we put in a solar thermal array that's taking care of all the hot water needs of this sort of massive, massive rail yard where things get overhauled and also stored. And by using this sort of solar thermal array, we're avoiding at least $94,000 a year that we would spend on electricity. So we're going to sort of do these arrays at other places, and it's the kind of investment that doesn't affect your ride, but it's part of trying to green the operations of the MTA. So why don't I just stop there because I don't want to monopolize it, but I just do want people to begin to think about transit is not just a place to get from A to B, but as a climate stabilization tool in a country that's going to need a whole cluster of stabilization tools.
Great. And Juliette has some prepared remarks as well. Good. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to provide a slightly different angle and focus it more on the region and focus it on the commuter rails that we were talking about earlier. So I don't have to tell a crowd of New Yorkers that living near a train station, living near a subway station, is more expensive than living farther away, right? Everybody wants to live near the CBD. Everybody wants to have an easy commute. And in theory, that makes sense, right? Every minute that you're spending commuting is a minute that you can't be spending at home, can't be spending at work, and it's worth some dollar value that is theoretically at least capitalized in property values near train stations. And you speak to any realtor, speak to anybody who's rented an apartment in the city will just sort of know that instinctively. But a couple years ago, I set about to actually calculate that. And I decided to focus on New Jersey, in particular sort of crossing the Hudson on New Jersey Transit. And there were three main reasons for that. First, there was something to really calculate because New Jersey made three very major improvements to their service over the course of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and I'll go over them in a second. And secondly, because New Jersey is a really important part of the region economically. So between 1990, these numbers always amaze me, between 1990 and 2009, so 20 years basically, the number of new suburban commuters traveling into Manhattan from Long Island has basically remained steady. Number of people coming in from Connecticut has grown by about 7,000. From the Hudson Valley has grown by about 9,000. From New Jersey has grown by about 75,000 people. So in terms of what is fueling the growth of Manhattan and the jobs that are available here, and therefore the larger economic region, New Jersey is really, really a very important part of that. And then the third reason to do it was, this was in 2009, when the project called ARC was still on the table, and we wanted to bolster support for it. Is everybody familiar with what the ARC project was? Okay. So ARC, actually, I'm going to describe it in just a minute. It'll make more sense in a minute. So let me first talk a little bit about those three projects that I mentioned that three improvements that New Jersey Transit did. So when New Jersey Transit Incorporated in the 80s took over from private railroad companies, they inherited a network of freight and passenger rail that was largely focused on Hoboken. And only the Northeast Corridor really ended up in Penn Station. And so when New Jersey Transit started, they, pretty much from the outset, realized that they had to redirect several of their lines, or provide new access to Penn Station from several of their lines that ended in Hoboken. And in the 1990s, they built literally 600 feet of new track to connect a line that was going to Hoboken to a line that was going to Penn Station. And were able to run trains on the Morrison-Essex line straight into Manhattan. A few years later, they did the same connection from the Montclair line that used to end up in Hoboken to a line in Penn Station. And then a year or two after that, so we're now talking in the mid-2000s, they built the Secaucus Junction, which is not a direct connection to Penn Station, but is a much easier transfer from some of the northern lines than going through Hoboken and taking the path. All three of those projects were incredibly successful in terms of just reduced time commuting. I mean, on average, all of those saved about 10 minutes per station. You know, some stations saw much more than that, some much less. And the ridership on those train lines went up significantly. And of course, you know, part of the reason for that also was that all of the there's only 5 ways to cross into the Manhattan CBD from New Jersey, and all the others were basically at capacity. And so New Jersey Transit gained a lot of ridership. In fact, it became so popular that the tunnel that runs from New Jersey to Penn Station, which is, by the way, 1 track in, 1 track out for every single New Jersey Transit, every single Amtrak train that goes to Washington, was at capacity, is at capacity, continues to be at capacity, because even though New Jersey Transit had planned for 20 years to build a second tunnel under the Hudson River to connect New Jersey Transit's extensive network into Penn Station, their efforts were thwarted in 2010? No. It was definitely October, and it was after my second son was born. So I think it was 2010. Anyway, the project was, Governor Christie decided that the project was over budget and that New Jersey was going to be on the hook for the additional expenses, and just cut it out of the budget, to everybody's surprise. So setting that aside. So going back to my original question, how did those 3 improvements improve the value of homes near train stations? Anecdotally, once again, you know, you'll talk to any realtor in Montclair, any realtor in South Orange, Maplewood, and so on. These are all communities that came back from having been largely abandoned in the 1960s to, you know, new communities with wealthy commuters commuting into Manhattan to high-paying jobs. So what I did was looked at data that realtors put together just sort of internally in a system called the Multiple Listing Service, and studied the sale of 53,000 different properties before the transit improvements took place and after the transit improvements took place. And using a multiple regression analysis, built a database of, you know, these 53,000 properties and several significant variables that could affect the value of their homes. So the number of bedrooms, the year that the property was sold to account for, you know, changes in the economy, the architectural style, the quality of the school district, and so on, and the amount of time that that was saved at the nearest train station after the New Jersey Transit Improvement went in. And what I found was that on average, you know, every community is different and so on, but on average, every minute that people's commutes got shorter added about $2,000 to the value of homes within 2 miles. And within walking distance, it added about $3,000 per minute. And once again, you know, in many of these stations, the improvement was 10 minutes. So you're talking, you know, real noticeable increases in home values near train stations. And so cumulatively, you know, then we started looking like at if you count how many homes are within 2 miles of New Jersey Transit stations, and you know, that is a very dense network of homes out there in New Jersey. The cumulative effect was to add $11 billion to the value of homes. And these 3 projects altogether cost less than $1 billion. So huge return on revenue. Also, and not as a, you know, a secondary benefit, but a equally important one, was that if you assume that people will commute a certain number of minutes, we'll find a commute of an hour, say, acceptable. Because train service to Manhattan was that much faster, the commuter shed effectively spread out into New Jersey, right? The geographic area that that was within a reasonable commute of Manhattan expanded. And so what I calculated was that with these improvements, the number of homes that were within an hour's commute of Manhattan increased by 25%. That's hugely significant. You know, incomes in Manhattan are much, much higher than in New Jersey. And it's not just significant, by the way, on the New Jersey side of things. I mean, on the New York side of things, it's for employers who have, for businesses here, they have access to a much larger pool of workers, and a very educated one at that, right? Suburban workers who are more talented, I guess, than sort of the average, and more educated than the average regional worker. So, and then remember again, the purpose of the study initially was to, one of the purposes was to bolster support for ARC, which at the time we didn't know was in trouble. And I guess the study really didn't help. But the value that we found ARC, so then we came up with our best guess for how much time would be saved at each station, each and every station on the New Jersey Transit network, thanks to ARC. And we found that the added value to homes would be about $18 billion. And this at the time that the project cost about 10. Maybe would have cost up to 12. So still, you know, ultimately worth it, but obviously not the same people who are spending the money as the people who are seeing the increase in values. So I guess, you know, I guess from this lesson, other than even what I thought was a good report, doesn't really change the course of things sometimes. I do think that there are several lessons from this study that are worth noting. First of all, to remember that the best way to capture the value that investments in infrastructure, and particularly rail, makes is to build densely around train stations. The increase in value was much, much more drastic within half a mile than farther away. And so if you're going to be building the railroad, if you're going to be spending $10 billion to improve the railroad system, you ought to invest in a land use system that capitalizes on the gains within walking distance or very short driving distance of train stations. And then another lesson is that there is a lot of value there that can be captured. And value capture is a term that is tossed around a lot and that hasn't been experimented very much in the United States, but that other countries have done pretty well at, and that is figuring out how to build a tax system that will, where the government can spend money up front to build an infrastructure project, a very expensive one, and then regain money on the back end from increased, from taxing the increase in value that comes from the infrastructure project. And the U.S. could really benefit from exploring that more. So those are sort of, yeah, what I'd say.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
All three panelists raised a number of very thoughtful and provocative points. At this point, I'd like to ask Christian to come up to the table. We have about 10 to 15 minutes left, and I'd like to open it up to questions for anybody who has questions for anybody on the panel regarding the history, the current challenges, how to pay for these investments, whatever it may be. Yes?
What seems to be not clear is, what I don't seem to hear is the automobile and oil industry. I mean, I think that is really the problem is. I mean, I've heard, not to say there, but I've heard the same talks a long time ago when we were talking about satellite cities and so forth, and Portland, Oregon built a system where they got the first transportation grants from the United States government and all, and then it faded away, and the automobile, as we know, was stronger and stronger, and gasoline people and oil people were too. So I think that's where the the opposition lies, and very, very strong. So, and you can't take us away, the American public, away from our treasures, which is the automobile, to get around. And
Would anyone like to
pollution and everything else could go into it. I wish you'd talk something about that, and how it was actually, excuse me, Los Angeles.
Somebody else have a quick minute so we can get some extra questions. Let's go first.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. So I mean, I think, there are clearly parts of the country that are totally auto-dependent and have no prospects of sort of mass transit or even bus rapid transit and that sort of thing. So there, you sort of hope that they get to using low-carbon vehicles. But since most Americans are going to end up living in cities, right, and in places like Chicago and New York, there's a real opportunity to kind of get the change in behavior, get people out of cars and onto transit, or at least if they own a car, they'll think they won't use it as often. I mean, in places like Japan and Germany, people have cars, but they drive them. They don't drive them as often as Americans do. And the other thing I'm seeing, because I have a son who's 26 and one who's 22, there's less interest in owning a car, I think, among millennials and other people coming up. That's sort of, I, as a baby boomer, when you got to be a teenager and out of college, the sort of symbol of growing up was getting a car, getting a used car, getting a new car. Well, I don't think that's true anymore. That's breaking down. And so this sort of interest in a car as a symbol of middle-class life, I think, is really declining. So that'll help some. It doesn't answer your question about the power of oil companies or coal companies. But I do think demographically things are changing, and the interest in car ownership is really declining.
I have to say something. I'm slightly more pessimistic than Ernest. Going around America as I have for the last 3 years, I've spent time in America, and it is quite remarkable for a European like me to see that the dependence on car and their absolute inability to kind of break that. I agree that I think the quick wins are to be done in urban areas, and I think, light rail and transit systems and bus systems in urban areas would get more carbon kind of reduction than big high-speed rail schemes. I think that's true, but it involves a bit more than that. I mean, I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, earlier in the week, and it was amazing that there's a train station there, but there isn't a car rental. There isn't a bus that serves the train station, and in fact, the taxi driver actually refused to take me because my hotel was too near, and he wanted to get a kind of a better fare, and so it involves a big cultural shift to get people to use more transit, and yes, in New York, I mean, it really is noticeable when you travel around the country that in New York the level of obesity is probably 20% that of the level of obesity in car-dependent places. And I don't know how you translate that into policy, but it's as well as carbon kind of gains, as well as the sheer joy of not having to use your car, there is the obesity issue, which should be linked to transport in a big way.
I just wanted to ask kind of a two-pronged question about kind of financing these different initiatives that we're talking about. In the U.S., I know like the value capture system is really a lot less than you'd see in places like China. But on top of that, our costs for creating rail and investing in it is a lot higher because of existing policies. So how do we combat both of those kind of structural deficits that we are facing as we're trying to do these investments?
Buzz, I think that's one for you.
Well, first place, China's building its railroads with American money, so I think that's one way of looking at it. All from the money goes to Wolmar, then to China, and then you build a railroad. It's a little facetious, but that's basically where China's the balance of payments is getting a lot of its money. And China is smart enough to have people like Siemens build things for them too, and operate them. I think. We've really fallen down in this country in the fact that we don't invest in large projects anymore. Second Avenue subway, it's being drawn out for 17 years. And in London, he said the Crossrail is taking, if it was built in the 20s, it would have been done in a year. And Crossrail is just, it's great engineering. And engineers would be proud to say that we can do it in 3 years in London. We could also do it in a year in London if we didn't have all these regulations. So delaying projects costs money. The uncertainty with funding projects in the United States comes basically from the fact that who's going to pay for it? We no longer, the government says it's only going to be a minor partner in paying for it. Taxpayers don't want to pay for improvements in their system. You see that nobody wants to pay more in gasoline taxes, income taxes. We're the lowest tax country in the world, probably, other than countries that don't have taxes at all. But we've lost the will to do things imaginable. That's why we don't talk about high-speed rail. Everybody poo-poos it. We could have high-speed rail in certain corridors, and it could be great. We built cross-country rail. We built the interstate highway system, 42,000 miles of high-design highway in basically 10 to 12 years, adding on to it. And then we built the railroads across country. We built a great airline network, but it's ready to be refurbished. And we don't have the money to build next generation air traffic control. So the real thing is that the public no longer feels that the United States is a place of innovation and creation other than maybe new TV shows or something like that. And it's very frustrating to somebody who's a civil engineer who recognizes we have this incredible talent and are doing great things. Walk through the East Side Access Tunnel, walk through Second Avenue subway, and you'll see some of the most terrific civil engineering that this country has done in years. The ideas for the new Tappan Zee Bridge can be great civil engineering. But the pressure to do that, the pressure to innovate, we're not going into space anymore. We've abandoned our space program. We're not part of particle physics anymore. We don't do anything unless, quote unquote, there's a bottom line or business purpose for it. We've got to take the country back from Wall Street and give it back to the engineers and reinvent and rebuild again and give people, let people wake up in the morning and say, we're innovators, we can do great things, and let's show the rest of the world that we can build railroads and 21st century, not 19th century railroads and and rail systems better than anyone in the world, better than Shanghai or better than Hong Kong. Right now, we're way down the list in innovation, and that's part of the problem.
And not to, be too trite about it, but when you think about, infrastructure projects last a very long time. Yes, they're very, very expensive, but they last a really long time. And if you think of any major piece of infrastructure that has been built, let's say the Tappan Zee Bridge, let's say the New York City subway system, let's say, the water tunnel, doesn't even have to do with transportation. Of course these projects have paid for themselves over and over and over and over again. But what's missing is just the political will to see beyond, the elected officials' current term or next term. And it's true, it's a cultural shift and it's a political shift, and it's one that's going to be very hard to transform for sure.
So I think that there is a cultural shift happening. Younger generations are choosing less and less car ownership. They're choosing cities over suburbs. But I do see that the politicians are behind. And I wonder if you have ideas about how to get the politicians on board, because they're not building the mixed use, they're not zoning for it, they're not even allowing, they're not allowing the infrastructure or the new kinds of developments to take place. So people might be choosing mass transit much more often, but it's not an option for them.
You should campaign for and vote for people that will do what you want. If you don't vote, you get what you pay for, in a sense. So you've got to vote. You've got to get your colleagues, people your age, to go out and vote and get candidates. You should run for office. There's nothing wrong with being a politician or having a political life. But you've got to, it's hard work like any other job. Run for office, vote for people that you want, work for them, eventually it'll pay off. But right now I think you look at how many people vote in every election, and in a country that has free elections, a minority of the people vote, and that's what we get in office.
Is there a question back there, and then
You talked a lot about investment and and the need to put more money into these projects, and you cited like Second Avenue Subway, for example. But Second Avenue Subway isn't only expensive; it's like absurdly expensive. It's like what, something like $1.5 billion.
What does it cost if it lasts 100 years?
Well,
600,000 riders a day. What is it per rider per day?
All right, per rider, whatever. But
that's the answer.
Can I finish my question? Can I finish my question? So it's $1.5 billion per kilometer. Crossrail is what, about $1 billion it's about $1 billion a kilometer, right?
15 billion pounds at $25 billion for 3 mile of tunnel and some bits outside.
Well, anyway, if you cost it out per kilometer, in the Second Avenue Subway, it doesn't cross any rivers, it doesn't cross any subway lines, it doesn't even really cross under any skyscrapers because it goes straight under Second Avenue. And yet it's something like twice as expensive as Crossrail, which goes under the entire London Underground network, the Thames a couple of times. Something like 4 to 6 times as expensive as Paris's line, which go under, the Seine, they cross under every other subway line. Why does it cost so much? Why does it cost so much more than it costs in Europe?
You get somebody from the MTA to answer.
Funny enough, Crossrail isn't cheap, but it probably is a bit cheaper than that. And I asked this question of its chief engineer the other day. I said, why do things cost so much more than they used to cost when, the first bit of that, I wrote a history book about the London Underground, the first underground line in London was built for £1 million in 1863. It was 5 miles long. That's probably equivalent to about £250 million now, $350 million, right? It was very cheap, really, for 5 miles of nearly 5 miles of line. And I said, why is it? And he said, that people just demand higher standards these days, that they require, the stations to be reasonable. They require the trains to have air conditioning or whatever. They require, the safety requirements are much greater. I actually wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer, actually. I thought it was an engineer's answer. I agree with you in the end.
It's not just expensive compared to the past, it's expensive compared to London, Paris, and Japan. So
but they're all expensive. Modern systems are very expensive now. And I don't really know the answer. I wasn't entirely satisfied with his answer.
Hi, Christian. In your talk, you alluded to a slight aversion of the California project. Could you just elaborate a little bit about why you think it's not going the way it should?
Are you Brit? You sound British.
I grew up in the UK. I'm Ugandan, actually.
Okay. I think it suffers from the same thing. I mean, I think, $98 billion, which is what the latest estimate is for some 500 miles of railway, I think it would be much better to focus on improving the existing railway to a reasonably high standard, the sort of standard we have in Europe, so 100-mile-an-hour railway. So you'd get between Los Angeles and San Francisco in 4.5 hours or something. And cost that out and see what that would cost, rather than jumping, as it were, a generation in technology from not really having an adequate railway at all to having this kind of all singing, all dancing railway that is going to cost so much that, look, if politically you could get away with it, I'd support it. But I think that politically, it's just going to founder at some point. The voters, the governor are just not going. At the one point, they're going to say, we just can't do this, and that's why. I mean, in a perfect world, I'll say do it. But I think in the real world, do something a little bit more basic and improve that and get people back into the railway habit and then go from that to something bigger. That's all my theory. I don't know if it washes, but that's my theory.
This will be the last question.
Hi. I'm just wondering if any of you are familiar with the Honolulu Rail Transit project happening in Hawaii. No, not at all? Okay, never mind. I was just going to see what your opinions on it were, because it's an interesting situation in terms of regional, because the government's designing basically a 20-mile-long rail system to service a region that's only about 600 square miles with a population of 1 million, and it's going to be costing them upwards of $6 billion. So just something, I guess, if you haven't looked into it, I guess you could look into it.
Guys, I'll wrap up with just a couple of things. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I'd certainly like to thank Christian for coming all the way from across the pond, and then and thank the other panelists for joining us tonight. We've talked a lot about investment, and we've certainly on the panel talked a lot about investment in the future, but we also have to invest in what we have, which is something that we didn't really get a chance to spend a lot of time on. And certainly, I think, in the context of transportation and transportation and land use, these are critical issues. How do we pay for the system we have in the context of also wanting to invest for systems in the future? The most environmentally friendly systems we have, or the systems we can have, are the ones that we have now. There's a lot of carbon that goes into building new systems, so we have to weigh the new construction versus what our choices are. I think the discussion of value capture, where we can actually tie the real estate value into the way we finance our transport systems, is critical for moving forward. And I think that as the questioner asked, there's this issue of costs, and it is that we, the experts here, can't really give a solid, this is why it costs so much. But we all say it costs an awful lot of money to build these projects. And that's a real challenge, because there's a lot of sticker shock that comes along with these projects. Californians started to turn against their high-speed rail when the sticker price went to $100 billion. So there's a real challenge. We want to make sure that we have safe, affordable, efficient transport systems that we can afford to build. And certainly there's a lot of value that's in these systems, so we can afford to build more than we are. But yet, how do we actually get everybody on board with understanding that value, and what are the mechanisms in place to capture some of that value to pay for our systems? So these are big issues that obviously we didn't resolve tonight. We'll hopefully resolve it next week. But anyway, thank you again for coming. Christian will be around to sign books if you need, and answer any other questions. Thank you.